And we are back for our fifth session of the APAC region block for our 24-hour long event. And I am really pleased to be facilitating this discussion that we are going to have with Darian McBain, who is the CEO and founder of Outsourced Chief Sustainability Officer for Asia. And again, we're joined by Bertrand Concrete, who once more is the Chief Procurement Officer at Henkel and also the co-founder of the Sustainable Procurement Pledge. As I mentioned before our very short break, we're taking a little bit of a pivot and we're looking to share some really sort of ahead of its time, I would say, conversations around what we're calling the blue revolution. And this is all about the ocean economy, how we need to be driving sustainability within our oceans, and the role that procurement can play within that. So really looking forward to this discussion. Darian and Bertrand, thank you so much for joining me here today. Before we jump into the very, very first question, for both of you, I'm just going to publish a very quick poll, which you should be able to see on your screens now. Please do answer. The question is, which industries make up the ocean economy? Is it maritime shipping, fishing and aquaculture, deep sea mining, renewable energy, oil and gas, or coastal tourism? And Darian, I'll come to you with the first question while everybody is answering that poll. But can you share a little bit about what the blue economy is and why businesses should care about it?
Hi, Caitlin. Lovely to be here, and thank you for the question. I guess I'll share a few of my procurement credentials. So I've worked in supply chains and procurement for many years. My PhD was actually in supply chain management, and I used to work for the purchasing and supply agency of the National Health Service in the UK as their head of sustainability and head of policy. So I've spent a lot of time looking at procurement. I think the ocean economy, though, hasn't always been front and center. I won't give away the answers because people are still doing the poll, but obviously the ocean economy is made up of many different categories, and it's how they all interact that's important. And what I don't think people realize is that if you're looking at green procurement or climate change and the green economy, you can't actually go green without blue. So the oceans make up 71% of the Earth's surface. They actually regulate the temperatures of the world. They're the world's largest carbon sink, one of the largest sources of biodiversity. And so when we start to look at any of these environmental or social issues, indeed, it's one of the greatest employers in the world, the oceans, and also provider of food and protein. So when we look at all of these environment, social governance issues, we absolutely need to look at the oceans. And in fact, a big treaty was just signed at the United Nations a few weeks ago, the High Seas Treaty, which is very much about how do we extend ocean governance beyond the coastal territorial waters that ocean countries have.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And just as a quick follow-up to that, I think that it can be all too easy for us to disregard the role that we might play in something like this purely because we don't think that where we work directly impacts something like the ocean. So perhaps you could share what industries the blue economy is most relevant to, and who should be considering the blue economy as a key part of their business strategy moving forward.
So it's said that 90% of everything is sent by maritime shipping. So when you think of your supply chain and your logistics, particularly from a procurement perspective, you almost definitely, if you're sending material outside of one country, you will be involving the ocean economy in some way. So maritime shipping is absolutely vital. And I think we saw that particularly at the start of the pandemic in 2021. I was working for Thai Union, which is one of the largest seafood processors in the world. And we're looking at how do we get our fish from the oceans to the processing. So it might be caught in, say, Fiji. It had to be shipped to Bangkok for processing and then maybe going to a market in the US. if you didn't have maritime shipping or you didn't have fishing, you actually didn't have that protein. And we found that during the pandemic that people were doing what we called pantry stocking. So things like canned, stable forms of protein, people wanted to buy more in case the situation got even worse. And so that's just an example where two sectors of the ocean economy are absolutely vital for, food and protein, but also for shipping and logistics. So there's also many other areas that we can talk about today, but climate change is another big one, because with the role that the oceans play in regulating the Earth's temperature, the worse climate change gets, the more impacts we'll feel from the ocean economy.
Absolutely. And so I feel like some of the principles of the blue economy is just really understanding how there's an interplay between so many different moving parts. We saw that in the question that we asked for the poll, which, what are all of these industries that make up the ocean economy? And in a way, I feel like all of these answers really do indicate that they all play a bit of a role in that. And so with that in mind, and that sort of understanding that principle of the fact that everything is interlinked and everything plays into one another, Bertrand, I'd love to come to you with a question, which is, as a procurement professional, what do you see as the main opportunities and challenges for making the principles of the blue economy a key part of procurement strategy?
Thank you very much for your question, Kathleen. I think that it's mainly the opportunity to take a new perspective. It is a new perspective putting nature in the center, and the nature and the regeneration of the ecosystem at the core of the strategy, of the procurement strategy. I am not personally involved into the ocean economies as such. However, the relation I have with what we do at Henkel is that we have put nature as one of our pillar into our corporate sustainability. And the way we describe it is to protect and restore biodiversity with a focus on forests, land, and water, and with this ensure responsible sourcing of our resource stewardship. And this is where I do see very strongly the link as a professional in procurement, because it is to recognize that we are part of the ecosystem. And we are part of the ecosystem where our business and our innovation are taking place. And from that point of view, it's important to recognizing this, that it is the opportunity at the same time that we develop business and innovation, also to create the conditions to be able to have the social capital, but also to improve the conscious living in harmony with nature. So it's extremely complex, but that recognition is first extremely important to understand all that environment and to build up across. And then from a challenge point of view, it goes within. It is obvious that understanding what we do and what the impact we have, it is to get a transparency, and then to be able to transform it, to solve it. And solving it, it is not something you can do alone. And I think, Darian, where I'm back with you, is to say it associates many. It is not in isolation. And it is extremely important to understand that, to enhance that collaboration, and through this collaboration to realize what can be done to create the new opportunities, and at the same time creating a daily upskilling of what we have of the teams in the procurement, and that upscaling then to transform it into a community exchange, community management, community activities, and with these principles and this knowledge to manage the challenge I just mentioned.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I couldn't agree with you more. And Darian, one of the major messages that has come out of the last 4 hours of sessions is this increasing requirement for companies, when they are specifically wanting to implement sustainable procurement practices in a region as vast as APAC, is to understand the context, to understand the different communities that they need to go and embed these principles into, and to really think about it from the perspective of their suppliers, as opposed to a bit of a top-down approach, I guess we could say. And so very much in line with that, how do you think that we can ensure that the benefits of the blue economy are actually shared equitably, and that vulnerable communities are not left behind as we continue to work on this?
Thanks, Caitlin. That's such an important question, particularly for this region, because so many people are reliant on the oceans. I'm not sure if we saw the results of the poll or if that's coming out, but really the answer is that all of these sectors make up the ocean economy, and you have people working in them from all different parts of Asia Pacific, but all around the world. So I noticed that down the bottom of the poll, coastal tourism didn't get very many likes, but absolutely in Asia Pacific, anybody who's gone to lie on the beach somewhere in Asia Pacific is participating in the ocean economy. And you think, well, how well is my holiday going to go if I'm right next to a site that might be bringing in the minerals for deep sea mining, for example, or if there's oil and gas? Fishing and aquaculture, certainly on a small scale, does tend to happen close to coastal tourism, but maritime shipping, if you're on the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, do you want a large vessels going right past where you're snorkeling? Obviously you don't, and we need to protect the reef. So I think Bertrand's comment about thinking how we all fit within the ecosystem and how we can collaborate is very important for the ocean economy. And maybe that's the first start. So when I start to talk to people, whether it's from procurement or finance is another area that I've worked a lot in, I find that ocean literacy is one of the first things that we need to discuss. So how do you understand what these segments of the ocean economy are? What's the role that you can start to play? And then you can start to think about, how can I be inclusive? Is it looking at my sourcing policies? Let's say it's for fish, or maybe it's for transportation. What's the impact that procurement can play? And maybe that you need to go and work with other communities, other NGOs, other procurement professionals, universities who are doing research in this area, to help you build your understanding, but also those collaborations that will start to have an impact.
Brilliant. And a very quick follow-up question, and it is my own pure interest in the subject, but one of the other options on this poll was renewable energy, which also got no votes. Could you very quickly explain sort of the relation between renewable energy and the ocean?
Sure. So particularly we see in Europe that you have renewable energy. So offshore turbines would be a good example when you're looking out from out to sea from land, when you're seeing renewable energy there. A subcategory of that is that we're seeing in Asia Pacific can also be the undersea cabling. So I'll give a very regional example. There's the Sun Cable project that was moving ahead in Australia. It's now, I think, slightly on pause, but that was to build a very large solar farm in the Northern Territory in Australia. And renewable energy was going to be sent via undersea cable to Singapore and the ASEAN region. And so the oceans, even though the energy is being created on land through solar, the oceans had a vital part to play there in the undersea cabling and how that energy was distributed. So it's both solar and tidal is another key way of getting renewable energy, but also to think about the cabling and how we send electricity. Obviously, when you look at hydrogen, as the certainly maritime shipping industry is looking at how blue hydrogen or green hydrogen is shipped around the world, is another link to the oceans.
So it really, really does impact all different operations for any business, especially if they are wanting to implement sustainable procurement practices. Another question that has been coming up, or discussion point that has been coming up throughout the discussions that we've had today, is around financing, and that there seems to be this maybe reluctant acceptance that to be sustainable is going to cost money. And, I think that unnecessarily sort of excludes companies that aren't large and have huge profits and can afford to invest in sustainability. It's problematic to think of it that way and to just accept that that's the way it is. And of course, you also mentioned that you have a background in finance too. So sort of taking what we know from other sustainability initiatives, something like decarbonization that's maybe been around for a little bit longer, what innovative financing mechanisms are available to support the development of a sustainable blue economy? And how can we scale up those successful models?
Depending on which angle you're coming from a corporate perspective, most likely you're going to access finance through loans. So whether you're looking at a sustainability linked loan or a sustainable bond. So the green bond principles have been around for over a decade, and really they also apply to blue if you're looking at the oceans. If I give a very practical example, when I worked with Thai Union, we got our first sustainability linked loan in 2021, and it was directly related to some of our activities in the ocean, particularly the installation of electronic monitoring systems on fishing vessels, which were in our supply chain. So because this was a supply chain activity, we had to purchase the electronic monitoring systems, teach our suppliers how to use them, how to share the data. Very much went back to a supply chain issue. And one of the things that I find is not always understood is that the information that the financial sector is basing their assessments on, so the risk information, the risk profile, generally is supply chain data, supply chain and procurement data. So you need to have that information so that the financial institutions, whether you're looking at banks, whether you're looking at impact investors, whether you're looking at insurers, can make a proper assessment of the ESG risks of the investment that they're likely to be making. And part of that is going to come down to procurement and the data that you collect and how you're able to share that data. So it shouldn't be excluding smaller businesses, but I think there is an opportunity to look at how you can aggregate demand. Often, particularly if you're looking at, let's say, some kind of venture capital, impact investment, or larger sustainability linked loans, it might be out of the reach of individual small enterprises, but you could look at the community, going back to one of Bertrand's earlier comments of how can you work with a community, how can you collaborate to get access to finance.
Brilliant. And again, collaboration has been a big theme for this first block. And there are many examples of even, procurement organizations that know that they don't buy enough to be able to really drive certain initiatives with their suppliers, of teaming up with competitors to get that sort of bargaining power that they need, or that buying power, I should say, to be able to then drive more sustainability with their suppliers as a joint initiative. And of course, Darren, you also mentioned data, which is one of Bertrand's favorite points and something that you're really big on driving, Bertrand. So in relation to that, where do you see a role for procurement to play in helping to scale up these models? And while you're answering that question, I'm just going to launch another poll for all of you to answer while we listen to Bertrand's answer.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. I think back to what just Darian said, I think there is a lot along collaboration and into us also pulling communities, but also collaboration with different partners. And this can be the new source of an opportunity to scale up financing mechanism. Why? Because then people coming to agreement, people coming to a project might lead to have a long-term mechanisms to finance these initiatives. On a very different angle, maybe I could refer to a situation that I know from my experience, is to use also a sustainable supply chain financing program where suppliers are being incentivized for strong sustainability performance. So, in other words, having financing conditions which are also very favorable. So, another one is from a very different area. If I look at renewable energy, very long-term contract agreements along VPPAs are also showing the opportunity to engage in a significant financing mechanism, which allows also to develop such programs. So I think there are a lot along collaboration, and there is a lot of opportunities along long-term agreement that which can be translated then with financing.
Brilliant, fantastic. So just to quickly run through the poll for all of you, please do pop down and answer if you want to. The question is, which activity is having the most negative impact on ocean ecosystems? Your options are acidification, ocean warming, plastic pollution, chemical pollution, climate change, and the destruction of habitats. We'll keep that open for you to keep answering. And of course, if you do have any questions for Darian and Bertrand, please do leave them in the Q&A. We'll make sure that we get to them. But Darian, we'll leave the poll up for a little bit longer. How do you see the blue economy evolving over the next 5 to 10 years? And what are the most promising sectors for growth? And what role do you think procurement can play in then bringing that to life?
I think there's a lot of opportunities, but at the moment it is recognition that the blue economy exists. It's kind of strange that if you think of that picture of the blue marble, which is the picture of Earth taken from space in 1971, one of the Apollo missions, I think, took that. It's the picture we all have in mind of when we picture Earth from space. It's mainly blue. And yet so many of our answers and thoughts, we as landlubbers, we live on land, we think about trees and green. We need to start to automatically think of blue. And so over the next 5 to 10 years, we need the oceans and their importance to start to come into discussions. And this is very early days at the moment. There's those of us who work in the oceans directly, and then there's the rest. And we need to make sure the rest start to bring ocean thinking in. If you look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals, SDG 14, which is life below water, is the least funded of all the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And if we're trying to solve for so many of our global problems, whether it is climate change, whether it's tackling inequality or zero hunger, a lot of those answers are still going to come from the oceans. And I think certainly in the short term, we need to just get better at thinking about how can we have an ocean mindset? How can we start to make procurement decisions which are going to have a more positive impact on the oceans, whether that's biodiversity, natural ocean systems, whether it's the interplay between the different sectors. I think one of the challenges that I see is that interplay or perhaps unintended consequences, because they're all in one ecosystem essentially that is linked. You will have impacts from one sector to the other. So deep sea mining would be a good example. There's now a demand for a lot more of the transition critical minerals, as we build more infrastructure around, let's say, solar panels, wind turbines. Those critical minerals, some of them will be coming from the oceans. And as we increase deep sea mining, what will be the impact on fisheries? What will be the impact on tourism? What will be the impact on nature-based solutions? So mangroves, for example, or coral reefs and seagrass beds. And I think we need to get much better at looking at the complexity of the decisions. So although a sector may seem like a growth sector, like deep sea mining, actually the UN High Seas Treaty has now will bring about a process to have much more robust environmental impact assessments so that countries and companies can think about those unintended consequences and the interactions between the different sectors.
Brilliant. It certainly is interlinked. Bertrand, can you draw parallels between what Darian is describing here and programs like decarbonisation, for example, when sort of decarbonisation was becoming a much bigger thing and more talked about? So do you think that there are some lessons that we can take from more advanced sustainability programs to apply to developing out the blue economy?
Yeah, yes, probably. I mean, there's similarities of, in particular, for example, if I take the example, as you mentioned, on decarbonization program, and reflecting on it, we realized that at that moment, certain technologies are not ready, are not available at the scalability which is required. We talk about large and scale where scalability is extremely important. And for this, it is important to develop and to bridge with new methods, with new technologies, and which have to be developed and fostered. So that's the moment where collaboration is probably coming. Collaboration into our own organizations, for example, combining procurement, research and development, and other stakeholders, and to be at the source of the development of these activities which are not available. But if I make a very direct parallel with also the decarbonization program we just managed and we are managing currently into the chemical industry, we recognize that the power of collaboration and the scalability of guidelines and processes will be of the highest importance to tackle the topic of product carbon footprint, for example. So it is not the problem and the challenge of one, it is the challenge of all. So we brought all the procurement team together at that stage of 40 companies. And these 40 companies put 20, and 20 together developed a new harmonized guideline, language, process that we are now transforming into a method and an ability to impact our respective product carbon footprint. It's a journey which will take 3, 6, 9 years to really move the entire. But we talk here as in the blue economy as massive element, extremely complex, and that complexity has to be tackled from the beginning, the data and the ability to engage at scale. So I follow you, Diane, into the power of collaboration in the extremely important approach, and I do believe that there procurement can have a huge impact, enhancing strongly the beyond my own horizon to really engage with a full profession in such challenges.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Bertrand. It feels to me like procurement really is at the absolute nexus of everything that businesses need to be moving into the future. Because without being able to drive this collaboration and without being able to lead on projects that really do push the boundaries of single organizations, exactly as you say, bringing many together to work on the same initiatives, it's just such an exciting space to be in. But Darian, do you have any examples of some successful blue economy initiatives? And can you share any lessons that we can learn from them now? And then how would you like to see businesses leading into this more?
Perhaps staying on the topic of decarbonisation, there has been some great movement within the maritime shipping industry. So the International Maritime Organisation, which regulates the shipping industry, set a decarbonisation target, which was 50% decarbonisation by 2050. A set of principles called the Poseidon Principles were established, going back to the theme of the day of collaboration. So we had the financial sector and the shipping companies coming together with their regulator, the IMO, to design what those principles were. They each side, the financial sector and the shipping companies, have to report transparently every year or 2 years on how they're doing on their decarbonisation journey. So it can't just be, yeah, we'll get there in 30 years. They actually have to show progress on an annual basis. And that transparency and that data is helping to inform the decisions and drive the innovation that's needed to decarbonize the industry. So it's a good example of an industry coming together. They are still competitors, but they realize that for the technology needed to decarbonize this particular industry, they need to collaborate. So I think that's one good example. Probably I'd go to the seafood sector and fishing as another good example of collaboration for the blue economy. Things called fishery improvement projects. And I don't want to get too techie on fish because I can go way down a deep ocean hole here. But nobody owns the oceans. So countries have their EEZs, their economic zones, but beyond that are the high seas, which is what the High Seas Treaty was just about. But fishing companies, seafood companies, realized that they needed better controls over the oceans. So there are regional fishery management organizations, but from a commercial perspective, there was the establishment of fishery improvement projects. And one of those that I worked on, Cioti, which is in the Indian Ocean, had, I think, 21 different players coming together. So some of those commercial aspects, and it would be the procurement and buying teams who were part of those because they're the ones who dealt with the fishers and the fishing vessels, as well as governments and NGOs. And everybody came together to agree what are called harvest control rules. So you can't take more than a set amount of fish out of this area over a certain time period so that the stocks can remain stable. So then you can certify that fishery to a standard, in this case the Marine Stewardship Council, which then you can communicate to your consumers and customers that there is a sustainability angle. But it all comes down to that collaboration and thinking long term. Very easy if you just want to continue fishing at the maximum level, you might get a return today, but you won't have fish in the longer term if you're taking that approach. So you need to all collaboratively agree on an approach for how much fish you can take from a particular area at one time. So I think these examples of collaboration, almost pre-competitive collaboration for sustainability, and then you have an absolutely vital role of the procurement professionals and then communicating that data and the activities to the ultimate customers and consumers.
What was the ultimate motivation that brought those companies together to agree to those thresholds? Because as you say, I can imagine it's all too easy for many to just think, I'll just take what I can right now, as opposed to having that longer term mindset. How did whoever it was that was bringing everybody together manage to really get that buy-in from multiple organizations?
It was a few different actors coming together, but it really does come down to the concept of the status of the stocks. And so the status of fish stocks is published by a few different organizations. It does ultimately come back to the IUCN, and when they publish a species endangered or not. And it's well known that various fish stocks around the world have collapsed. It's not an impossibility, it's not out in the far future. If you overfish, a fish stock will collapse. And so the collaboration comes around when there's a notification that a particular fish stock is going dangerously low, then the players know that they need to come together to really take action on this. So I would say ultimately, in this case, and it's quite positive, the driver is the science behind the status of the stocks. And then it's a commercial decision because you can't keep buying fish if the fish no longer exist. It doesn't matter how good your procurement policies are or how good your sustainability policies are. If there aren't fish in the ocean, you can't buy them.
Thank you very much. That makes a lot of sense. I'm going to go back to the poll that we launched a little bit earlier, which was around which activity is having the most negative impact on ocean ecosystems. We see plastic pollution, ocean warming, and climate change really getting the majority of the votes over there. So Darian, perhaps you can talk around a little bit of what the most pressing issues are that really need to be addressed to ensure that the blue economy is sustainable and resilient. You can tell it's getting a bit late for me now, but yeah, sort of what needs to be addressed to ensure that the blue economy is sustainable and resilient, especially in the face of global challenges like climate change and resource depletion, which we've just been talking about.
So really all of these issues are important. In essence, the poll is just highlighting that we need to look at the interplay between all of these topics. So climate change is, I guess, the broader umbrella under which many of these issues fit. And with climate change, we're seeing ocean warming and ocean acidification. Acidification has a very negative impact on the species living in the oceans. Ocean temperatures rising will also have a negative impact. Obviously, you have coastal communities who are under threat with coastal inundation from extreme weather events. I think plastic pollution might be an interesting one to delve into. We heard Bertrand speak about decarbonisation, which obviously is something that we need to do if we're going to limit the impacts of climate change. But I think limiting the amount of plastics and single-use plastics that are used and how they end up in the ocean is something that procurement professionals could definitely have a direct impact on. And I'd be really interested to hear Bertrand's thought about packaging and choice of packaging and how that could link to better ocean outcomes.
Bertrand, please do take the floor.
No, thank you very much. I think this is always the matter of also understanding what are the ecosystems to put in place to avoid that these packagings are going to the ocean first. And we know how complex it is and how it is easy to say complex it is. I have been personally involved very strongly with an organization named Plastic Bank, which has put in place a business involving local communities and making it, trying to make it to create a circular economy around picking up all these packagings along the seaside and other places and reintroduce them into the supply chain to really be an initiative of that a circular economy. So and we are very much involved with them and continue to be. So this is what I mean by understanding the complexity of an agenda and not only to have one solution, but to go through many solutions. So I'm sharing this one because this one was not the obvious. It required also a change of considering to invest, to be entrepreneurs, and to set up a new systems. And of course, you have more elaborated ones, which are long technology and the way to develop these packagings and the processes around. But it starts always by a call to what can I do and how should we change the game. And then that's at least referring to your question, Darian, what comes immediately to my mind as initiative that procurement can do. And this is why I'm always saying from that point of view, there is no fatality. It is a solution somewhere is in our hands.
So I think that's absolutely true. And I know, I've worked in purchasing. How you look at products and the life cycle assessment of those and the impact on the environment is very important. And so plastics, of course, you want to stop them before they get into the ocean. So collecting plastics from the beaches or rivers is good, but if we can stop them getting there in the first place and look at the circular economy and how that can be factored into procurement decisions, you're avoiding a problem downstream. So I know when I was with Thai Union looking at reusable containers, so systems like Loop, where you could fill a container, a consumer could utilize it, and then it's collected back and refilled and reused. Systems like that could, for example, reduce the amount of waste and plastic in particular that's going into the oceans, which does have a negative impact, particularly on biodiversity in the oceans.
And this is where probably that, if I may, Kathleen, Darian, you opened the topic of collaboration and partnership. I mean, this is definitely the moment where where that collaboration, international collaboration, and requires a lot of focus. And this is where the procurement organizations have definitely a very important responsibility to take, um, especially in this area where it's all about nature. And by definition, talking about nature requires to work across industries, to work across also with different partners, I would say partners beyond the immediate, and then to collaborate and to collaborate very intensively. Eventually, it requires to have some vertical integrations activities, but also I think at the end of the day, it requires first to have an attitude and a very strong level of understanding and a very strong level of transparency. Understanding the context, understanding the ecosystem is probably the most important, and to understand all the supply chains which are related around, and then to be very inclusive. Inclusion, from my experience at least, is one of the enabler allowing to come to solutions, because starting to work with all partners together, industries, NGOs, and then having that mindset is the beginning of changing the game for the long run.
100%. Thank you, Bertrand. You've spoken to this really not just throughout this session, but throughout the day, and this idea of collaboration and this idea of partnerships to help develop initiatives, whether it's the ocean economy or decarbonization or human rights. But how do you think collaboration also plays a really important role in ensuring that these partnerships are actually effective and inclusive, as opposed to just being nice things that people can join?
Well, I think that it starts when you really define together objectives, and then these objectives are getting measured, and these objectives are also shared from that beginning. So it is not, as you just mentioned, nice. It is really to tackle a specific topic. And that learning I got, for example, through this decarbonization slash this product carbon footprint. I mean, it's everybody talks about it. It's, oh, okay, what can we do? And being into the mindset of a procurement was to say, let's tackle the challenge at the source. And then at the source means to understand it, and understanding it means to be extremely open, but also to go deep and to make it really tangible, so technically tangible, and process-wise tangible. And from there, having that transparency, and this is how we design it and developed this guideline, and not a guideline invented or developed only for the chemical industry, but a guideline building upon guidelines existing with other organizations which have developed very strongly on the topic of product carbon footprint, as an example. But I take that example, but it is very complex. It is very bright. It requires a lot of collaboration. So if it is feasible in one area, why not into another area? So not being an expert on this blue economy, I do believe that level of complexity requires a lot of associations and collaborations and engagement to make it happen. So this is feasible, and this is where definitely these activities can go much beyond the talking about, to make it extremely tangible, and not to stop as long as we have not progressed with visible impact on the objective to reach.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Darian, we have a question here from the audience that I think is a really good one to come to now, which is how important is supply chain transparency in maritime shipping environments, and what are some of the initiatives that we can take to ensure that transparency?
So I think supply chain transparency is important in any part of the economy, not just the blue economy, but particularly for the blue economy, because activities happen offshore. You can't necessarily see what is happening. So even the most remote factory, you can always go there. Actually, you can't get access to some vessels when they're in the high seas. It's very difficult. So it makes auditing difficult. You can't always have real-time data connections. I mean, we're getting much better at that with satellite connectivity, but the transparency and being able to trust the data is vital. So I mentioned the Poseidon principles, and how built into that was transparency on both sides, from the maritime shipping sector for what their decarbonisation pathways are and what progress they're making. But actually from the financial sector, the transparency was to show how they are funding the decarbonisation. And so you need both, because of course what you don't want is the financial sector saying, we will bank you if you are decarbonising, but then not actually doing that. So transparency on both sides are important. In seafood sector, you also have transparency standards, so the Global Dialogue for Seafood Traceability has key data elements for wild capture and aquaculture, which will help with transparency all the way along that supply chain. We're seeing great leaps, I think, with technology to help, whether it is satellite data and the likes of Global Fishing Watch, where you can actually monitor where fishing vessels are, whether it is with electronic monitoring systems, whether there's cameras using machine learning and AI to sense if, for example, an endangered or threatened species has been caught or harmed, alerting whales of shipping paths and trying to use some kind of sonar to get them out of the way. I think there's some great leaps that can be made using technology, but transparency has to be there. And I think a really important point of what Bertrand mentioned was that you have to have an objective. You have to know what it is that you're trying to achieve when you come together to collaborate. Otherwise, it is just a nice meeting, and it might be good to catch up with friends, but having that objective, being clear about what you're trying to achieve, the timescales that you're going to achieve it, is another important part, I think, of transparency.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Darian, one final question for you to bring this session to a close and to leave our audience with some practical next steps. But what should companies who have a supply chain footprint in our oceans be doing to advance the sustainable development of our oceans?
So maybe the first step is that companies should look at where their supply chains and procurement activities do interlink with the ocean economy. And as I said, they almost all will, depending on maritime shipping. And then there could be further, depending on what products they're sourcing. I mean, ocean biological materials are actually in a huge number of products. I was interested to learn that most toothpaste is actually made with a chemical that's derived from algae, seaweed. So, there's an ocean economy, bits of the ocean economy come into so many different supply chains and procurement decisions. So maybe the first step is to think about, how does what you are doing relate to the ocean economy, and then think about some of those major problems that we just looked at in the poll, whether it's climate change, whether it's acidification, whether it is plastic pollution, and start to consider how your activities can have a positive impact on the oceans.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. So we're going to wrap up this session today. Darian, thank you so much. Bertrand, thank you so much for sharing your perspective. I absolutely feel like it really does all come down to transparency, understanding really how we come into contact with the ocean in ways that we didn't think we even did, and then partnership and collaboration. But to finish up with one more poll for this session, again, please do let us know your feedback on whether you enjoyed this session and if it met your expectations. We will be using this to ensure that we continue to develop sessions for you in future WSPDs that really is helpful to you and not just nice, as we were saying. Brilliant. So we are now going to be going into our final session for our APAC block, where we will be joined by Priya Agrawal, who is the Social Sustainability Manager for Living Wages at Unilever. And we will also be joined by a well-known face to SPP, Mr. Oliver Hurry, They're going to be talking about understanding procurement's role in ensuring a living wage in the supply chain. So Bertrand, Darian, thank you so much for this session. I found it really informative. And I'm going to go and check what ingredients are in my toothpaste straight away. But of course, we will see you all again very soon in about 10 minutes time. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.